So right now, as I'm recording this podcast, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 quarantine. And it's been interesting for our family. I generally work from home most of the time now. Well, pretty much all the time. And so I get to spend quite a bit of my time with my kids, but they're out of school. So 24/7, these kids are here. We can't really do a lot of the things that we want to do. And so one of the things that we've done, which has been pretty interesting, one of the things that we've done to kind of change up things and make things more fun for them is we have now at our house what we call story time. And so my kids in general love to hear some of the wacky, zany, and crazy stories, not only of my wife's childhood and growing up, but we've told our kids about um, the story about how my wife and I met. We've talked about each of our kids and kind of the story behind their births and what kind of little babies they were. And the kids just really love it. Everything from my 25-year-old oldest son who's married now all the way down to my 12-year-old twins. They love what we call story time. And it's been interesting because, at some point you tell all the great stories and you tell all the fun stories, but at some point you get into some of the stories that have impacted your life that aren't so great or aren't so fun. And stories of peril or discouragement or difficulties in your life start to come out. And it's been real interesting because as I've decided that it's okay to share the stories of difficulty, it's always come back around to, as we told these stories of difficulty, two things always happen. One is we kind of end those stories with what did we learn from those events in our life that were difficult or painful. And the other is that all of these difficulties or trials in our life have an ending point. And that's been pretty interesting to me because as we go through this COVID right now, it's really tricky for a lot of people. A lot of people are struggling. A lot of people are having difficulties, and I get it. And while you're in the middle of something, it's difficult to see the end. And so sometimes that can be discouraging. But if you look back on all the difficulties in your life or the different situations you've experienced, there was an end. There always is an end. And my kids have kind of come to understand that this too will end, and it'll be a great story, right? We'll have some stories of some of the things that we did. And so I want to challenge you to do two things. And I want to start by telling you a quick story about, and this was a story I told my kids on Sunday. Sunday night, they wanted to hear a story. And some of you may have heard this story, but when I was a little kid, I grew up in an inner city area of Dallas called Oak Cliff. And it was kind of a little bit of a rougher neighborhood. Some might consider it the hood. But a lot of the kids that I grew up with were not as fortunate as some of the kids growing up. We didn't have a lot of money, so we didn't have a lot of the finer things in life. But what we did have was a basketball hoop. On every corner in every neighborhood, there was a basketball hoop, and there was always games starting up. And I'll never forget when I was probably, 10 or 11, I was pretty sure I was going to be a good basketball player, but I was competing against some kids who were much better athletes than me, just had practiced a whole lot more. And I remember it was just hard for me to even get on the court. And once I did, I wasn't treated very kindly, right? And for multiple reasons. But I remember one day coming home at the end of the day, as kids when we grew up, we came home whenever the street lights flicked on. That was the message that we needed to come home, right? We'd wake up in the morning, we'd leave, we'd go out and play all day long for however much time we could. And then when the street lights flicked on, that meant it was time to go home. So I remember one night coming home, and I had my basketball tucked under my arm, and I was a little discouraged. And my dad could kind of see that. And he said, "What's going on, Kyle?" And I said, "Well, I kind of had a tough day. I really wanted to play basketball today, but every court I went to, I could barely even get on the court. They didn't want me to play. I was kind of a small kid. Like I said, not very athletic. And even when I did get on the court, they were rough and tough, and they wouldn't even let me shoot. These guys were going to prove how good they were by proving how bad I was. And so that was a consistent theme for me as a young man, is I really had to first of all, fight to get on a court, and second of all, they were going to make it tough on me. And it was especially tough this day, and I remember almost getting into a couple fights with some other kids over it. But I came home and I said, you know what, Dad, I don't know if basketball is a thing for me. I mean, I can't even get on the court, and when I do, and I told him about how tough they were and nasty to me and just fouling me all the time, and he said, and I said, I don't really know if basketball is a thing for me, and he said something. I don't think he came up with this, but he said something to me at that moment that was pretty interesting to me because I was not real happy about this, and I was kind of frustrated. And he must have known me better than I knew myself at the time because he said, you know what, Kyle? Don't wish it were easier. Wish you were better. And then he smiled at me and he said, well, you got your own basketball hoop in your backyard. Go out there and shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot until you make every shot. And then when you get out on that court, you fight for your opportunities to get those shots. And you get those shots, and when you do, you make them. You become a threat. And fight back. I mean, if guys are going to rough you up, rough them back. It's a sport. You got to learn to play on whatever level you're on. And, as a 10 or 11 or 12-year-old at the time, it seemed kind of rough. But I can remember my dad had a real profound impact on me on multiple occasions, and this was one of them. And I'll never forget, I thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go in the backyard, like Dad said, and I'm going to shoot until I just don't miss. I mean, I'm going to practice shooting until every shot I get, I'm going to make. And I went out and I practiced and practiced and practiced and got so good at shooting that, sure enough, when I went out on the court, it didn't matter what kind of way they were guarding me. It didn't matter what they did. If I caught the ball and I was anywhere close to open, I was going to make it. And it kind of changed the way that the guys saw me, right? They saw me go out there and they saw me fighting for position. And I taught myself how to run in and out of people and set screens for myself and use other people to get open shots. And by golly, when I got the shot, I made it. And I'll never forget, as I got a little older, and the competition continued to get better than me, right? And I was small and skinny and frail. And I remember I got onto the court one day. I got to the courts one day, and you'd have to wait to play, right? You'd get 3 or 4 guys. We called it who you going to run with, right? And you had 4 other guys that you chose, and you had next up on the games. And so I'll never forget the day I showed up, and I'm standing there, and I walked up and I said, who's next? And one guy said, you're with us. And he had 4 other guys ready, and I showed up, and he said, you're with us. And I said, perfect. And that's all. Once I heard that, I stopped talking, right? And I was just waiting my chance. And so I got out on the court, and it was 9, I'm not kidding, it was 9 black guys and me. And I'll never forget, one of the guys on the other team that we were facing said, make sure you cover that white guy because he can shoot. And so I walked up to the guy that said it, and I said, how do you know I can shoot? And he said, because if you couldn't shoot, you wouldn't be on this court. And it really, right, it was a confidence boost for me. But it was a result of what my dad had said a while back. Don't wish you were easier. Wish you were better. And, in telling my kids this story, it was part of that was for them to understand the lesson behind it, the lesson that I learned from this experience, and how that applied to our ability during this COVID, right? A lot of us are quarantined. It's hard for a lot of us, right? We wish it were easier. And, I wanted to share with them at that moment, don't wish the quarantine situation was easier. Wish how can we be better? What can we do to let this be a way for us to grow and learn and become better people? And so I want to challenge you as dads to start telling your kids the story, even the stories that are the stories of difficulties. Because here's what happens when you tell your kids the stories of difficulties. Number one, they know that you had some difficulties in your life, right? Sometimes I think our kids think we just breezed through childhood and now we're adults and we got it made. And by telling your kids these moments of difficulty in your life, they're going to know that you've experienced some of the things that they're going to experience. And they'll connect with you because of that. They'll also come to you when they have these difficulties. When they have difficulties in their life, they'll say, my dad had some situations. Maybe he'll know how to help. right? And that's what we want. We want our kids to come to us when they're struggling or when they're having difficulties. The second thing is we want them to know it ends, right? We want them to know that if we fight through these difficulties and if we make it out of the other side, and we always do, if we will make it, number one. And number two, there's a lesson to be learned in every difficulty, in every trial in our life. There's a lesson to be learned. And it's interesting because some of the stories that I was able to tell them, I've been able to tell them over the past couple of weeks. I don't know that I really had a lesson really keyed in on what the stories meant. And as I created this pattern of telling my kids these stories, at the end of my story, I'd say that's the end of the story, and they'd say, "What did you learn?" Right? And I started to having to tell them, you know what? I don't, you know what? I have to think about that. What's the lesson? And we kind of discussed some of the lessons we could learn, right? And some of the lessons, as kids, they say, well, you learned you can never do that again. And I said, no, I don't think that's the lesson, right? And you want to allow them the opportunity to discuss with you how to learn good lessons, how the trials in your life can offer you opportunities to grow and learn good lessons. And I think that's the key here. So as you go throughout these weeks or however long this quarantine takes, take some time. Start telling your kids about your difficulties. Start telling your kids stories about your life. They remember them. And they love those stories. And they'll sit there and they'll say, really, wow, I never knew, right? And sometimes you get a chance to recall those memories and how they impacted your life. And hopefully they impacted your life in a good way. And if they didn't, change the ending for yourself, right? Don't change the ending of the story. Tell the story as it is. But change the lesson you learned so that they can learn the good lessons and start to really realize that as they go through difficulties, there's lessons to be learned and there's good lessons to be learned. So hopefully that's helpful. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.